A people were chosen, and we have seen what a chosen people can do. They can judge, they can involve in cases, even in legal cases,
Yeah.
and they have been given authority to bless. I I saw that and then I felt like, what does that mean?
Mm.
If they were given authority to even bless, bless, and what is blessing?
Prosperity, goodness, peace.
I like to see the dictionary meaning of blessing.
Okay.
Blessing. Hallelujah. Because if we don't know what we are able to do, we'll just stay in the role and not understand what we're supposed to do. Hallelujah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
We'll get that first one.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Blessing. So, which dictionary is this?
This is Oxford's
Oxford Languages. Okay,
Yeah.
good. Mm-hmm.
So a blessing is simply God's favor and protection.
God's favor and protection.
Yeah.
And it's